The fence post knew his secrets better than any confessor. Every night, Thomas placed a single biscuit there, a communion with ghosts that never answered back. The Wyoming wind had stolen his voice years ago, leaving only the ritual, flour, butter, hope baked into something small enough to hold. Until the morning he found crumbs and a folded paper that made his hands shake like autumn leaves. Someone had been watching, someone had been hungry too. The sun died behind the mountains with the same indifference it had shown for 3 years, painting Thomas's ranch in shades of amber and regret. He stood at the kitchen window, flour still dusting his weathered hands, watching shadows stretch across the endless Wyoming grassland, like fingers reaching for something they'd never touch. The silence in the house pressed against his chest, thick as the dust that settled on Sarah's untouched piano, on the small boots still waiting by the door, on the dreams that had withered like wildflowers in drought. His boots echoed against the wooden floor as he walked to the oven, each step a metronome, marking time in a life that had forgotten how to dance. The biscuits sat golden and perfect on the tray, their warmth rising like prayers he'd stopped believing in. 6 biscuits. Always 6, though only one would make the journey to the fence. The others would grow cold on the counter, joining yesterday's loneliness and tomorrow's certainty that nothing ever changed in this corner of the world where hope came to die. The screen door creaked its familiar protest as Thomas stepped into the evening air, the biscuit wrapped in a clean cloth, warm against his palm, like a small heart still beating. The fence post stood 50 yards from the house, weathered grey as his own soul, marking the boundary between his land and the vast emptiness that stretched toward town. He'd chosen this post deliberately, visible from the kitchen window, close enough to watch, far enough to pretend he wasn't waiting for miracles that never came. 3 years ago, the ritual had begun as madness, a conversation with ghosts that lived in the space between sunset and darkness. Sarah had loved his biscuits, had stolen them warm from the oven, with Grace giggling beside her, their laughter filling the kitchen like music he'd never hear again. Now he baked them still, muscle memory stronger than grief, and left one each night on the fence post, like an offering to a god who'd forgotten his address. The evening wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, whispering secrets across the grassland that stretched toward the horizon like a promise the earth couldn't keep. Thomas placed the biscuit carefully on the flat top of the post, adjusting the cloth with the same reverence a priest might show the communion wafer. The ritual demanded precision, demanded faith, demanded the kind of hope that hurt more than despair, because it refused to die completely. As he walked back toward the house, Thomas didn't look over his shoulder, didn't allow himself the luxury of watching and waiting. The biscuit would sit there through the night, growing cold under the stars, until morning came, and he'd find it exactly where he'd left it, untouched, uneaten, a monument to the futility of feeding ghosts who'd learned to live on memory alone. Dawn crept across the ranch like a thief, stealing the darkness that had become Thomas's closest companion, replacing it with the harsh honesty of daylight that made shadows retreat and secrets impossible to hide. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee growing cold in his hands, steam rising from the cup like the breath of something dying, his eyes fixed on the fence post that had become the altar of his nightly devotions. The biscuit was gone, not scattered by wind, not claimed by the coyotes that sometimes prowled the edges of his property, but simply absent, as if it had never existed at all. Thomas blinked hard, certain that grief had finally claimed his vision along with everything else, but the empty fence post remained stubbornly real, the cloth folded neatly beside it like a flag of surrender. His boots hit the porch with the urgency of a man discovering fire, coffee forgotten on the windowsill, as he strode across the yard with his heart hammering against his ribs like something caged and desperate. The morning air bit at his face, sharp with the promise of winter, but he barely felt the cold through the heat of possibility that had ignited in his chest for the first time in 3 years. The cloth lay exactly where he'd left it, but beneath it, pressed against the weathered wood of the post, was a piece of paper folded small as a prayer. Thomas's hands shook as he lifted it, the paper soft and worn, as if it had been carried for miles, handled by fingers that knew the weight of secrets. His name was written on the outside in careful, childish letters that made his throat close, with something between hope and terror. Inside, the message was brief, written in pencil that had been pressed hard against the paper, as if the words themselves were struggling to escape. "Thank you for the biscuit. It was the best thing I've eaten in days. My name is Grace. I live in the old cabin by Miller's Creek. I'll come back tonight if that's okay." Below the words, a small drawing of a flower, petals uneven but earnest, the kind of art that children make when they're trying to give beauty to a world that's forgotten how to be beautiful. Thomas sank onto the porch steps, the note trembling in his hands like a butterfly that might take flight at any moment, carrying with it the first real hope he'd felt since the day the world had ended and left him breathing in its ruins. Grace. The name carved itself into his heart with the precision of a master craftsman, settling into the space that had been empty for so long he'd forgotten it existed. The morning sun carved long shadows across the ranch as Thomas stood at his kitchen window, Grace's note pressed between his calloused fingers like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. The paper had grown soft from his touch, the careful letters blurring slightly, where his thumb had traced her name over and over through the sleepless hours. He had read those words so many times they had become a heartbeat, a rhythm that matched the steady pulse of something awakening in his chest. The silence of his house felt different now, not empty, but expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath for what might come next. Outside, the fence post stood like a sentinel against the endless Wyoming sky, and Thomas found himself staring at it with the intensity of a man watching for salvation. The morning chores called to him, but his feet remained rooted to the worn floorboards, his eyes fixed on that simple wooden barrier that had somehow become the most important place in his world. The cattle moved restlessly in the distance, their lowing carried on the wind like ancient songs of longing, and Thomas felt their restlessness echo in his own bones. He had spent 15 years learning the language of solitude, mastering the art of existing without expectation, without hope, without the dangerous luxury of caring about another human soul. But Grace's note had shattered that careful construction with the efficiency of a sledgehammer against glass, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own defenses. The biscuit tin sat on his counter, its metal surface reflecting the morning light in fractured patterns that reminded him of broken promises and second chances. He opened it slowly, the hinges creaking like the sound of a heart learning to beat again, and selected the largest, most perfect biscuit from the batch he had made before dawn. His hand shook slightly as he wrapped it in a clean cloth, the simple act feeling as momentous as signing his name to a contract with fate itself. The walk to the fence felt longer than usual, each step weighted with the gravity of what he was about to do. Thomas had always been a man of few words, his conversations limited to the occasional exchange with the feed store clerk or the veterinarian who came to check on his livestock. But now, as he approached the weathered post where Grace had left her note, he found himself composing sentences in his mind, crafting responses to questions she hadn't asked, preparing for a dialogue that might never come. The fence post stood exactly as he had left it, but everything about it seemed transformed, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. He placed the wrapped biscuit carefully on the flat surface, then pulled a pencil stub from his shirt pocket, along with a piece of paper he had torn from an old feed catalogue. The words came slowly, each letter formed with the deliberation of a man who understood that some messages could change everything. "Grace," he wrote, the name feeling foreign and wonderful on the page. "Thank you for the note. I hope you like the biscuits. If you want to talk sometime, I'm usually here in the evenings. Thomas." He stared at the words for a long moment, reading them over and over, wondering if they said too much or too little, if they revealed the desperate hunger in his heart or masked it behind polite formality. The paper trembled in his hands as he folded it carefully and placed it beside the biscuit, weighted down with a small stone he had picked up from the path. The act felt like releasing a dove into the sky, not knowing if it would return or disappear forever into the vast emptiness that surrounded his small corner of the world. He stood there for several minutes, memorizing the scene, burning the image into his mind like a photograph he could carry with him through whatever came next. The wind picked up, rustling through the sagebrush and carrying with it the scent of rain and possibility. As he walked back toward the house, Thomas felt the weight of the day settling around him like a familiar coat. But underneath the routine rhythms of ranch life, something new pulsed with quiet insistence. He found himself glancing toward the fence throughout the morning, his attention divided between the tasks at hand and the magnetic pull of that simple wooden post. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching like taffy in the heat of his anticipation. He repaired a section of corral fencing, his hands moving automatically, while his mind wandered to thoughts of a small girl brave enough to approach a stranger's fence in the darkness. The work felt different now, infused with purpose beyond mere survival, as if he were preparing his small kingdom for a visitor who might change everything. By afternoon, the anticipation had become a physical ache in his chest, a sweet torture that reminded him he was still capable of caring about something beyond his own solitary existence. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded Thomas of hope itself. He had always loved this time of day, the quiet transition from light to darkness that marked the end of another day, survived. Another night to be endured. But now, as he watched the shadows lengthen across his land, he felt something he had almost forgotten existed: excitement for what the darkness might bring. The fence post stood silhouetted against the dying light like a monument to possibility, and Thomas found himself walking toward it with the careful steps of a man approaching a miracle. His heart hammered against his ribs as he drew closer, his eyes straining to see if anything had changed, if Grace had returned to claim her biscuit and leave another piece of her world behind. The evening air carried the promise of rain and the whisper of dreams about to unfold, and Thomas knew that whatever he found at that fence would determine the shape of all his tomorrows. The biscuit was gone, and in its place lay a folded piece of paper that made Thomas's hands tremble as he reached for it. The evening light was fading fast, forcing him to squint at the careful handwriting that had already become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. "Dear Thomas," the note began, and he felt something crack open in his chest at the sight of his name written in her small, precise letters. "The biscuits are the best I ever tasted. My mama used to make them, but not as good as yours. I live with my grandpa now in the old cabin by Miller's Creek. He doesn't know I come here, but I think he wouldn't mind. You seem nice. Can I ask you something? Do you ever get lonely? Grace." The words hit him like a physical blow, each sentence peeling away another layer of the armor he had built around his heart. She lived by Miller's Creek, less than 2 miles through the woods that bordered his property, close enough that he could probably see smoke from their chimney on clear mornings if he knew where to look. The question about loneliness hung in the air between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross until now. Thomas folded the note carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, where it rested against his heart like a talisman against the gathering darkness. He stood at the fence for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the vast Wyoming sky, thinking about a little girl who had the courage to ask the questions that adults spent lifetimes avoiding. The wind carried the scent of pine and creek water from the direction of Miller's Creek, and Thomas found himself wondering what Grace's world looked like, what kind of man her grandfather was. What circumstances had brought them together in that remote cabin? The not knowing was both torture and gift, leaving space for his imagination to fill in the details with hope instead of fear. He walked back to the house with Grace's question echoing in his mind, the simple words carrying more weight than any conversation he had shared with another human being in years. That night, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with a piece of paper spread before him, the pencil feeling clumsy in his work-roughened hands. How did you explain 15 years of solitude to a 10-year-old girl? How did you describe the way loneliness could become so familiar it felt like a friend, so constant it became the rhythm by which you measured your days? He started and stopped a dozen times, crumpling failed attempts and tossing them into the fire that crackled in his stone hearth. The flames consumed his words like hungry spirits, leaving only ash and the persistent ache of things left unsaid. Finally, as the clock on his mantel chimed midnight, he began to write with the honesty that only darkness could provide. "Dear Grace," he wrote, "yes, I get lonely. So lonely sometimes that I talk to my horses just to hear a voice, even if it's my own. But your notes make the loneliness feel different, like maybe it's not permanent, like maybe it's just been waiting for the right person to help carry it away. Thank you for asking. Thomas." The words felt inadequate, too simple to contain the complexity of what she had awakened in him, but they were true, and truth was all he had to offer. He sealed the note in an envelope he found in an old desk drawer, then spent the rest of the night baking a fresh batch of biscuits with the care of a man preparing communion. Each ingredient was measured precisely, each step performed with the reverence of ritual, because he understood now that these simple offerings had become something sacred, a language of connection that transcended the barriers of age and circumstance and fear. The kitchen filled with the warm scent of butter and flour and hope, and Thomas found himself humming an old song his mother had sung while she worked, a melody he hadn't remembered in decades. The biscuits emerged from the oven golden and perfect, and he wrapped the best one in a clean cloth, with the tenderness of a man handling something precious beyond measure. Dawn came slowly, painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and promise, and Thomas made his way to the fence with the careful steps of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of changing leaves and the distant sound of geese calling to each other as they prepared for their long journey south. He placed the biscuit and the envelope on the fence post, then stood back to admire his offering, feeling foolish and hopeful in equal measure. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the landscape in sharp, clear detail that made everything seem possible. Thomas spent the day working with unusual energy, his movements quick and purposeful, as he repaired equipment and tended to his animals with the efficiency of a man who had found reason to care about the future. The fence post drew his attention like a magnet throughout the day, but he forced himself to stay away, to give Grace the space and privacy she needed to approach on her own terms. As evening approached, Thomas found himself standing at his kitchen window again, watching the fence post with the intensity of a man waiting for a verdict that would determine the rest of his life. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reminded him of the sunsets he had watched as a child, when the world had seemed full of infinite possibility and every day had held the promise of adventure. The fence post stood silhouetted against the dying light, and Thomas held his breath as he watched for any sign of movement, any indication that Grace had returned to continue their strange and wonderful correspondence. The minutes stretched like hours, each second weighted with anticipation and fear, until finally, just as the last light faded from the sky, he saw a small figure moving through the shadows toward the fence, and his heart began to beat with the rhythm of prayers being answered. Grace stood at the fence post longer than usual, her small silhouette barely visible in the gathering dusk as she read Thomas's note by the fading light. From his kitchen window, Thomas watched her shoulders rise and fall with what looked like a deep sigh, and he found himself holding his own breath, waiting for some sign of how his words had been received. She was smaller than he had imagined, more fragile, with hair that caught the last rays of sunlight like spun gold, and a way of standing that spoke of someone who had learned to be careful in a world that didn't always welcome small voices. The envelope crinkled in her hands as she opened it, and Thomas could see her lips moving slightly as she read, forming his words in the silence of the evening air. When she finished, she stood perfectly still for several minutes, and Thomas wondered if he had said too much, revealed too much of the raw hunger that lived beneath his carefully constructed solitude. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a pencil and paper, and Thomas felt his heart resume its beating with the force of relief flooding through his veins. The note she left was longer than the others, written in the careful script of a child who understood the weight of words and chose them with deliberation. "Dear Thomas," it began, "I'm sorry you're lonely. I know how that feels. My mama died 2 years ago, and my daddy couldn't take care of me anymore, so I came to live with Grandpa. He's good to me, but he's sad too. And sometimes the cabin feels so quiet, I think the walls might fall down from the weight of all the things we don't say. I like that you talk to your horses. I talk to the creek sometimes, and to the birds that come to our feeder. They don't answer back, but they listen, and that's something. I was wondering if maybe sometime I could meet you properly, not just leave notes. Grandpa says it's important to look people in the eye when you talk to them, so you know if they're telling the truth. Would that be okay? Grace." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, each sentence revealing layers of loss and resilience that made his own solitude seem small by comparison. A 10-year-old girl who had lost her mother and been abandoned by her father, living with a grandfather who carried his own burden of sadness in a cabin by the creek. Thomas folded the note with shaking hands, understanding now why Grace had approached his fence in the darkness, why she had been brave enough to reach out to a stranger who might offer nothing more than biscuits and the promise of someone who understood loneliness. She wanted to meet him properly, to look him in the eye and measure the truth of his words against the reality of his presence. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure, because he had grown so accustomed to solitude that the prospect of actual conversation, of sharing space with another human being, felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. But Grace had asked, and Grace had trusted him with her story, and Thomas knew that some invitations were too precious to refuse, no matter how much they frightened the man receiving them. He spent the night composing his response, writing and rewriting, until the words felt right, until they carried the proper balance of invitation and reassurance. "Dear Grace," he finally wrote, "I would be honored to meet you properly. Tomorrow is Saturday. If you'd like, you could come by around 4 o'clock. I'll make fresh biscuits, and we can sit on the porch and talk. You can bring your grandfather if that would make you feel safer. I understand about looking people in the eye. It's been a long time since I've done that with anyone, but I think I remember how. Thank you for trusting me with your story. It makes my own loneliness feel less heavy. Thomas." The words felt inadequate to express the magnitude of what she was offering him, the chance to step back into the world of human connection after so many years of exile. But they were honest, and honesty was the only currency he had to offer in this strange new economy of trust and hope. Saturday dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made every detail of the landscape stand out in sharp relief. Thomas spent the morning cleaning his house with the intensity of a man preparing for the most important guest of his life, dusting furniture that hadn't been touched in years, washing windows until they sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. He baked 3 batches of biscuits, wanting to have plenty on hand, then arranged them on his mother's best china plate, the one he had kept wrapped in tissue paper since the day he had inherited this ranch and all its ghosts. The porch received special attention, swept clean and furnished with 2 chairs positioned to catch the afternoon light, close enough for conversation but far enough apart to respect the careful boundaries that would need to be observed. By 3 o'clock, everything was ready, and Thomas found himself pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, checking his reflection in the mirror above the sink. smoothing his hair and adjusting his shirt with the nervous energy of a man about to take the most important test of his life. At exactly 4 o'clock, Thomas heard the sound of footsteps on his gravel drive, and his heart began to pound with the force of anticipation and terror combined. Through the window, he could see Grace walking up the path, her small hand clasped in the weathered grip of an elderly man who could only be her grandfather. They moved slowly, carefully, like people approaching something that might prove to be either salvation or disappointment. Thomas took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked to the front door, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the handle. This was it, the moment when their careful correspondence would either blossom into something real and lasting or crumble under the weight of expectations too heavy for reality to bear. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, and for the first time in 15 years, Thomas looked into the eyes of another human being who had chosen to see him not as a stranger to be avoided, but as a friend worth knowing. Grace smiled up at him, her face radiant with the kind of joy that could heal wounds and mend broken hearts. And Thomas felt the last walls around his heart crumble like ancient fortifications, finally surrendering to the irresistible force of love.